The night was heavy with silence, the kind that blankets a lonely highway and makes every sound sharper, more deliberate. Clint Eastwood, the legendary Hollywood actor and director, gripped the wheel of his dark blue sedan, his weathered hands steady on the leather. His eyes, those same steely eyes that had stared down outlaws in Unforgiven and criminals in Dirty Harry, were fixed on the stretch of asphalt illuminated by his headlights. It had been a long day, a film festival appearance that dragged into photo ops, interviews that never seemed to end, and the constant hum of Hollywood's demands weighing on his shoulders. Now, well past midnight, he was finally heading back to his ranch, the road cutting through a quiet corner of Louisiana, where he'd been filming his latest project. The street lights were sparse here, and the stars burned brighter than the city ever allowed. The hum of the engine was his only companion, a steady rhythm that matched the cadence of his thoughts. He wasn't speeding 65 miles per hour, right on the limit. His driving steady, his hands at 10 and 2. Years in the spotlight had taught him discipline, precision, the kind of caution that kept you out of trouble. So when the sharp flash of red and blue lights exploded in his rearview mirror, his first reaction wasn't fear or guilt, but confusion. His brow furrowed, his gaze flicking to the speedometer, then back to the road. No mistakes, no infractions. He hadn't swerved, hadn't run a light. There was no reason for this. Yet the police cruiser behind him didn't waver, its siren cutting through the night like a blade. Eastwood exhaled slowly, his jaw tightening as he signaled to the right, guiding his car onto the shoulder with the practiced ease of someone who knew the rules. He'd worked with law enforcement before, played cops and marshals on screen, understood the weight of a badge. This was routine, he told himself, just a quick check, a misunderstanding. But as the cruiser rolled to a stop behind him, its headlights bathing his car in a harsh white glare, a prickle of unease settled in his chest. Something about the way the officer was taking his time, too long, too deliberate, fell off. What happens next will leave you speechless. Stay with me. Eastwood adjusted his rearview mirror, trying to catch a glimpse of the man behind him. The cruiser's door finally creaked open, and out stepped Officer Daniel Kins, a figure cut sharp against the glow of the headlights. He wasn't tall, but his posture screamed authority, the kind that wasn't earned but demanded. His left hand rested on his belt, fingers brushing the holster of his firearm, while his right swung a flashlight back and forth, the beam slicing through the darkness. His boots crunched against the gravel as he approached, each step measured, aggressive. Eastwood lowered his window, keeping both hands visible on the wheel, palms upturned in a gesture of compliance. "Evening, officer," he said, his voice calm, steady, that unmistakable gravelly tone that had commanded respect in boardrooms and on film sets for decades. But Kins didn't return the greeting. He leaned down, his flashlight sweeping across Eastwood's face, lingering too long, the beam blinding. "License and registration," he barked, his voice flat, chewing gum with a slow, deliberate rhythm that grated on Eastwood's nerves. No explanation, no courtesy, just a demand. Eastwood's eyes narrowed slightly. This wasn't how it was supposed to go. "May I ask why I'm being pulled over?" he said, keeping his tone even, professional. Kins stopped chewing for a moment, his head tilting as if the question itself was an insult. "License, registration." The words were slower this time, each one clipped, a warning wrapped in them. Eastwood held back a sigh. He'd seen men like this before, small men with big egos, the kind who leaned on their badge to feel taller. But he wasn't here to argue. Not yet. "All right, officer," he said, his voice still measured. "I'm reaching for my wallet in the center console." He moved slowly, deliberately, his right hand sliding toward the console while his left stayed on the wheel. He pulled out his wallet, flipping it open to reveal his driver's license. He held it out, expecting some flicker of recognition. After all, his face had been on movie screens for over 6 decades, from the good, the bad, and the ugly to Gran Torino. He was an American icon, a living legend. But here's where things take a shocking turn. But Kins barely glanced at it. His eyes flicked to the ID, then back to Eastwood's face, his expression unchanging, cold. Eastwood nodded once, his patience thinning, but his composure intact. "Now, can you tell me why I'm being stopped?" Silence stretched between them, thick and heavy, broken only by the faint hum of the cruiser's engine. Kins chewed his gum again, his jaw working slowly, deliberately, before he spoke. "Step out of the vehicle." The words hit like a punch, not because they were loud, but because they were wrong. Eastwood blinked, his mind racing to process the command. "Excuse me?" he said, his voice still calm, but sharper now, a thread of steel running through it, the same edge that had made his characters unforgettable. Kins took a half step back, his right hand now hovering near his firearm, his left still gripping the flashlight. "Step out of the car." The tension in the air thickened, pressing against Eastwood's ribs like a physical weight. He'd been in high-stakes situations before, directing Oscar-winning films, navigating Hollywood's power struggles, even facing down critics who said he was past his prime. But this was different. This wasn't a negotiation. This was a man with a gun, a badge, and an attitude that screamed trouble. Eastwood's pulse stayed steady, but his mind was already running through scenarios, calculating risks. He knew the protocol, knew his rights, but he also knew how fast things could spiral when a cop decided he didn't like you. "Officer, I've complied with your requests," he said, his voice low, deliberate. "I've shown you my identification. There's no reason for this. If there's an issue, let's call your supervisor." Kin's jaw flexed, irritation flashing across his face. "I don't need a supervisor," he snapped, his voice rising just enough to betray his temper. "I said get out." Eastwood didn't move, not out of defiance, but out of caution. His instincts, honed over years of navigating power dynamics, both on and off camera, told him this wasn't about a traffic stop. This was about control, about a man who saw a challenge in Eastwood's calm, in his refusal to cower. "On what grounds, officer?" Eastwood asked, his tone unwavering, his eyes locked on Kin's. For the first time, the officer hesitated, his lips parting as if searching for a response. But instead of answering, he did something worse. He took a step closer, the flashlight dropping to his side, and his right hand unfastened the snap on his holster. The click was soft, but it echoed in Eastwood's ears like a gunshot. "You won't believe what happened next. Keep listening. I don't have to explain myself to you," Kin said, his voice low, dangerous. The air between them crackled, the weight of the moment pressing down hard. Eastwood's heart beat steady, but his mind was a storm of calculations. He'd read the reports, seen the news, stops like this going wrong, escalating in seconds, ending in tragedy. He wasn't naive. He knew the power a badge carried, and he knew the danger of a man who thought he was untouchable. "You do, actually," Eastwood said, his voice calm but firm, cutting through the tension like a blade. "You're required to articulate a reason for this stop and for any further action. I'm Clint Eastwood, and I'm not stepping out until you tell me why." Kin's face twisted, a flash of anger breaking through his composure. "I don't give a damn who you are," he spat, his hand now resting on the grip of his gun. The flashlight beam swung wildly as he leaned closer, his silhouette looming in the window. "You think that name means something to me? Get out, or I'll make you." The threat hung in the air, raw and unfiltered. And for the first time, Eastwood felt the weight of real danger, not the choreographed kind from his films, but the kind that came with a loaded weapon and a man who didn't care about consequences. Eastwood's fingers tightened on the wheel, not out of fear, but out of focus. He knew he had to stay in control, to keep this from spiraling. "Officer, you're making a mistake," he said, his voice steady, his gaze unyielding. "You're escalating without cause. Let's de-escalate this. Call your supervisor and we'll sort it out." Kins let out a low, humorless chuckle, the sound chilling in its arrogance. "The mistake," he said, "was thinking you could pull rank on me." And then, before Eastwood could respond, Kins reached for the door handle, his fingers curling around it with intent. The click of the handle sent a jolt through Eastwood's body, not fear, not yet, but a sharp awareness that this was no longer a routine stop. His left hand shot out, gripping the inside handle to keep the door shut. "Step back, officer," he said, his voice firm, commanding, the kind of tone that had silenced rooms full of studio executives. "You're out of line." Kins didn't move. If anything, his grip on the door tightened, his knuckles paling under the strain. "I said get out," he growled, his voice raw with the kind of authority that didn't ask for permission. Eastwood's mind raced, weighing his options. He could comply, step out, and hope Kins didn't push further, but that meant surrendering control, putting himself at the mercy of a man who clearly had none. He could resist, stay in the car, but that risked escalation. And with Kins' hand on his gun, escalation could be deadly. He directed films about men facing impossible odds, had played characters who stared down death with a squint and a snarl. But this wasn't a movie. There was no second take, no stunt coordinator, no script to save him. "You're crossing a line," he said, his voice low, controlled, but with an edge that carried weight. "You know who I am. This isn't worth your career." Kins' lips curled into a smirk, his eyes narrowing. "Career?" he said, almost laughing. "You think you can scare me with that? I'm the law out here." The arrogance in his voice was a spark, igniting something in Eastwood, not anger, but resolve. He'd spent his life standing up for what was right, on screen and off, fighting for stories that mattered, for the rule of law. But then, a voice cut through the darkness, like a lifeline. "Hey, I'm recording this." The shout came from the side of the road, piercing the suffocating silence. Eastwood's eyes flicked to the source, careful not to turn his head. A woman stood there, maybe 30 feet away, her phone raised, the glow of the screen reflecting off her glasses. She was at a safe distance, but close enough for her camera to catch every detail: Kins' gun, his stance, the Hollywood legend pinned in his car. "This is the moment that changed everything. You have to hear this. You sure you want to do this, officer?" she called out, her voice steady despite the weight of the moment. Kins froze, his hand still on the door handle, but the shift in his posture was immediate. A flicker of hesitation, a crack in his armor. He didn't lower his gun, but his eyes darted toward the woman, then back to Eastwood, calculating. Eastwood seized the moment. "Put the weapon down," he said, his voice stronger now, carrying the weight of authority he'd earned over 8 decades of life. "You're being recorded. This is over." Kins' jaw clenched, his breathing shallow, his mind clearly racing to find a way out. The woman, Sarah, Eastwood would later learn, kept her phone steady, her voice ringing out again. "I've got it all, officer. The whole world's going to see this." The words were a hammer striking at the foundation of Kins' bravado. For a moment, no one moved, the air thick with the weight of what came next. Eastwood's heart pounded, but his face remained calm, his eyes locked on Kins'. He knew this wasn't over, not yet. But the balance had shifted, and for the first time, he felt the faint stirrings of hope that he'd make it through this night. The highway shoulder was a stage now, lit by the harsh glare of headlights and the pulsing red and blue of Kins' cruiser. Clint Eastwood stood beside his sedan, his hands still raised, not in surrender, but in a calculated show of restraint. The air was thick with tension, the kind that made every sound, the crunch of gravel, the hum of engines, the faint crackle of a police radio, feel like a prelude to chaos. Officer Daniel Kins stood a few feet away, his hand no longer on his gun, but still hovering near his holster, his face a mask of defiance barely concealing the panic creeping into his eyes. Sarah, the witness, held her phone steady, its red recording light a silent accusation that kept Kins in check. Her presence had shifted the dynamic, but the danger wasn't gone. Eastwood knew it, felt it in the way Kins' jaw twitched, in the way his shoulders stayed rigid, as if he were still weighing whether he could salvage his authority. The actor's mind was sharp, processing every detail, the angle of Sarah's camera, the distance between him and Kins, the faint sound of another siren growing louder in the distance. He'd been in tough spots before, but this was a different kind of battlefield, one where words and evidence were his only weapons. Kins' eyes flicked toward Sarah again, his lips curling into a sneer. "Put that damn phone down," he snapped, his voice raw with frustration, but there was a tremor in it now, a crack in the armor of his bravado. Sarah didn't flinch. Not a chance, she shot back, her voice steady, her phone unwavering. "You're not in charge here anymore." The word stung, and Kins' face reddened, his hand twitching toward his belt as if instinct were pulling him toward escalation. Eastwood saw it, the moment where a desperate man might double down, and he spoke before Kins could act. "Officer, you're on camera," he said, his voice calm but firm, cutting through the tension like a blade. Every move you make is being recorded. Think about what comes next. Kin's gaze snapped back to Eastwood, his eyes narrowing, but he didn't respond. The actor held his ground, his hands still raised, his posture open but unyielding. He wasn't just a Hollywood legend anymore. He was a man fighting for justice, and he knew the weight his name carried, even if Kins refused to acknowledge it. What happened next shocked even the most seasoned officers. Listen closely. The distant siren grew louder, and within moments, another police cruiser pulled up, its lights sweeping across the scene. The door swung open, and a second officer stepped out, Officer Blake, a broad-shouldered man with a face that betrayed no emotion. He strode toward Kins, his eyes flicking between the actor, the camera, and his partner. "What's going on here?" Blake asked, his voice low, cautious, as if he were stepping into a minefield. Kins didn't turn to face him, his eyes still locked on Eastwood. "Non-compliant driver," he said, the words clipped, rehearsed, as if he'd used them 100 times before to justify his actions. Eastwood's jaw tightened. Non-compliant. The phrase was a weapon, one he'd heard in too many reports, seen in too many headlines. It was code, a way to paint a victim as a threat, to twist the truth before it could take root. But this time, the truth had a witness, and it had a camera. Blake's gaze shifted to Eastwood, and for a fleeting moment, recognition flickered in his eyes. He'd seen the actor before on countless movie screens, in interviews, at award shows. His posture stiffened, but he didn't speak, his silence a signal that he was waiting for Kins to lead. Eastwood seized the opening. "Officer Blake," he said, reading the nameplate in the dim light, his voice steady, authoritative. "I'm Clint Eastwood. I was pulled over without cause, threatened with a firearm, and ordered out of my vehicle without explanation. I've complied with every reasonable request, and now I'm asking you to do your job. Detain Officer Kins." The words landed like a gavel, clear and unyielding. And for the first time, Kins' composure cracked. "You can't be serious," he spat, taking a step toward Eastwood, his hand brushing his holster again. Blake's arm shot out, stopping his partner mid-step. "Easy," Blake muttered, his voice low, but there was tension in it, a warning. Sarah's voice cut through again, sharp and unrelenting. "It's all on video, officers. The gun, the threats, everything. You want to be on the news tomorrow?" Blake's eyes darted toward her, then back to Kins, his mind clearly racing. Eastwood watched the exchange, his heart steady but his senses on high alert. He knew the power of a camera, the way it could shift a narrative, expose a lie. He also knew the danger of two officers caught in a corner, their careers on the line. Blake's radio crackled, a dispatcher's voice breaking the silence. "Unit 12, status." Blake hesitated, his thumb hovering over the radio. Kins' breathing was shallow now, his eyes darting between Eastwood, Sarah, and the approaching lights of yet another cruiser. The balance was tipping, and Eastwood knew he had to keep the pressure on. "Officer Blake," he said, his voice softer now, almost conversational, but with an edge that carried weight. "You've got a choice. You can back your partner and go down with him, or you can do what's right. You know who I am. You know this won't end here." Blake's face was unreadable, but his hand dropped from the radio, a small but significant gesture. Kins saw it, and his anger erupted. "You're not seriously listening to him," he snarled, turning on Blake. "He's just some actor trying to pull rank." Blake didn't respond, his eyes fixed on Eastwood, calculating. The third cruiser screeched to a stop, and two more officers stepped out, their hands hovering near their holsters as they took in the scene. One of them, a lieutenant with silver bars on his collar, strode forward, his gaze sweeping from Kins' tense stance to Sarah's phone to Eastwood's raised hands. "Somebody want to explain this?" the lieutenant demanded, his voice sharp, authoritative. "The twist that comes next will blow your mind. Stay tuned." Eastwood didn't hesitate. "Lieutenant, I'm Clint Eastwood," he said, lowering his hands slowly, deliberately, reclaiming control of the moment. "Officer Kins pulled me over without cause, threatened me with his weapon, and refused to acknowledge my identification. This woman has it all on video. I want him detained now." The lieutenant's eyes widened, recognition dawning. He turned to Kins, his expression hardening. Is that true? Kins' face twisted, a mix of defiance and desperation. He was non-compliant, he said, his voice weaker now, the excuse sounding hollow even to his own ears. Sarah stepped closer, her phone still recording. Non-compliant? She said, her voice dripping with disbelief. He showed you his ID, told you who he was, and you pulled a gun on him. It's all right here. She held up her phone, the screen glowing with the undeniable truth. The lieutenant's jaw tightened, his gaze shifting to Blake, who stood silent, his earlier neutrality now a liability. Cuff him, the lieutenant ordered, nodding toward Kins. Blake hesitated, his loyalty to his partner warring with the reality of the situation. Now, the lieutenant snapped, and Blake moved, pulling out his cuffs with a reluctant slowness. Kins' face went pale, his bravado crumbling as the cuffs clicked around his wrists. This is a mistake, he muttered, his voice raw, disbelieving. You're going to regret this. Eastwood watched, his expression unreadable, but inside he felt a surge of relief tempered by resolve. This wasn't over, not for Kins, not for him, not for the system that had let this happen. The lieutenant turned to Blake. You too, he said, his voice cold. Blake's head snapped up, shock flashing across his face. Sir, I didn't, he started, but the lieutenant cut him off. You stood there and let it happen. That's enough. Blake's shoulders slumped, and he didn't resist as another officer cuffed him. The scene was surreal, the flashing lights casting long shadows across the pavement, Sarah's camera capturing every moment, every shift in power. Eastwood exhaled slowly, his hands now at his sides, the weight of the moment settling into his bones. He turned to Sarah, meeting her gaze. Thank you, he said, his voice quiet but sincere. She nodded, lowering her phone but keeping it ready. Somebody had to, she said, a faint tremor in her voice now that the adrenaline was fading. The lieutenant approached Eastwood, his expression a mix of respect and unease. Mr. Eastwood, are you all right? He asked, his tone formal but genuine. Eastwood nodded, his eyes still on Kins, who was being led to a cruiser, his head bowed. I'm fine, he said, his voice steady. But this isn't about me. This is about what happens when power goes unchecked. I want internal affairs on this, and I want that video preserved. The lieutenant nodded, already pulling out his radio to make the call. As Kins and Blake were loaded into separate cruisers, Eastwood's mind shifted to what came next. This wasn't just a bad stop. It was a symptom of something bigger, something he'd seen in the stories of everyday Americans, in the letters that sometimes reached him from fans who'd faced injustice. This is where the story takes an incredible turn. You won't want to miss this. The morning after the highway incident, the world seemed to shift on its axis. The video Sarah had recorded, a grainy but undeniable record of Officer Daniel Kins' aggression and the tense standoff with Clint Eastwood, exploded across social media before the sun had fully risen. By noon, news outlets were replaying the footage on a loop. The image of Kins' hand on his gun, his sneer as he dismissed one of America's most beloved actors, burned into the public's consciousness. Hashtags multiplied. Op-eds poured in. Entertainment Tonight, CNN, Fox News, they all covered it. The Louisiana State Police headquarters was swarmed with reporters demanding answers. Hollywood figures, from Morgan Freeman to Tom Hanks, tweeted their support. The story wasn't just about a traffic stop anymore. It was about accountability, about power, about the fact that if this could happen to Clint Eastwood, it could happen to anyone. Eastwood sat in his home office at his ranch, a rustic space lined with film memorabilia and Oscars, his phone buzzing incessantly on the desk. He ignored it, his eyes fixed on a muted television screen where a pundit dissected the incident, gesturing wildly at a freeze frame of Kins' face. The actor's expression was unreadable, but his mind was racing, not with anger or vindication, but with a quiet, resolute determination. The night before had been about survival. Today was about accountability, not just for Kins and Officer Blake, but for a system that had allowed their actions to go unchecked for too long. He leaned back in his chair, his fingers steepled under his chin, and let the weight of the moment settle. This wasn't just his story anymore. It belonged to everyone who'd ever felt the sting of unchecked power. Here's what Eastwood did next, and it's powerful. Pay attention. The fallout was swift. By mid-afternoon, the Louisiana State Police announced that Kins had been stripped of his badge and charged with assault with a deadly weapon, a felony that carried the weight of years behind bars. Blake, his silent accomplice, was suspended indefinitely, his role as an enabler under scrutiny by Internal Affairs. The department issued a statement, carefully worded to express regret without admitting systemic failure. But the public wasn't buying it. Protests formed outside the state capitol, signs demanding reform and transparency swaying in the humid air. Eastwood watched the coverage from his office, his jaw tight. He'd seen this before, outrage that flared bright and then faded, buried under bureaucracy or political maneuvering. He wasn't naive. He knew how easy it was for the powerful to wait out a scandal, to let the noise die down until the world moved on. But he also knew he had something they didn't, a platform, a voice, and a responsibility to use both. He picked up his phone, not to answer the barrage of calls, but to dial a number he'd saved the night before. Sarah's. She answered on the second ring, her voice cautious but warm. "Mr. Eastwood," she said, the faintest hint of surprise in her tone. "I need your help," Eastwood said, his voice steady. "This isn't over. Meet me at the community center in Baton Rouge tomorrow night. We're going to talk to people, not just the press." The community center was a low brick building, its walls plastered with flyers for youth programs and voter drives, its parking lot filled with cars. By the time Eastwood arrived the next evening, word had spread. Inside, the air was thick with anticipation, the kind that comes when people know something bigger than themselves is at stake. The room was packed. Mothers with children on their hips, retirees in folding chairs, young activists with notebooks and questions. Sarah stood near the front, her phone no longer a weapon, but a symbol, a reminder of what one person could do. Eastwood stepped to the podium, his weathered face familiar to everyone in the room, the lines etched by decades of work and life. He didn't have a prepared speech, didn't need one. He'd spent his career telling stories that mattered, and tonight, he wanted these people to feel heard. "Good evening," he began, his voice carrying that unmistakable gravelly tone. "I'm here because of what happened 2 nights ago, but I'm also here because of what's happened too many times before that. What happened to me wasn't new. It was just caught on camera." A murmur rippled through the crowd, heads nodding, some faces tight with the kind of pain that comes from lived experience. Eastwood paused, letting the room settle. "I've played lawmen," he continued. "I've played outlaws. I've made films about justice, about the thin line between right and wrong. But that night on the highway, I wasn't playing a role. I was just a man facing a gun and a badge. If it wasn't for Sarah," he gestured toward her, and the room erupted in applause, "I might not be standing here. But here's the truth. Most folks don't have a camera, or a name that makes headlines, or a way to make the world listen. And that's why we're here, to make sure they do. This is the lesson we all need to learn. Listen carefully." He spoke for 15 minutes, not about himself, but about the stories he'd heard over the years, the letters from fans who'd shared their own encounters with injustice, the families torn apart by a system that too often protected its own. He didn't sugarcoat the challenges, didn't promise easy fixes, but he laid out a plan, a push for mandatory body cameras, independent oversight boards, and stricter penalties for officers who abuse their power. The crowd listened, some taking notes, others whispering to neighbors, a shared sense of purpose growing with every word. When Sarah took the microphone, the room went quiet. She wasn't a celebrity, wasn't used to speaking to crowds, but her voice was steady, raw with the weight of what she'd seen. "I was scared that night," she admitted, her hands gripping the podium. "I thought about driving past, minding my own business. But I couldn't, because if we all look away, nothing changes." She told her story, not just the video, but why she'd stopped, why she'd raised her phone. She talked about her brother, pulled over years ago, humiliated for no reason, his story buried, because no one was there to record it. "This isn't about one actor or one cop," she said, her eyes sweeping the room. "It's about all of us. We've got to hold the line, not just when it's on the news, but every day. The applause was deafening, a release of frustration and hope, and Eastwood felt something shift inside him, a recognition that this moment, this room, was the real battleground. The meeting stretched into the night, questions and stories pouring out. A mother spoke of her son, arrested on flimsy charges, his life derailed. A retired officer admitted to seeing colleagues cross lines, his silence a regret he carried. Eastwood listened, answered when he could, promised to carry their voices forward. By the time the room emptied, he and Sarah stood alone, the weight of the evening settling around them. "You meant what you said," Sarah said, not a question, but a statement about making this bigger than you. Eastwood nodded, his eyes distant but resolute. "I've got a platform. If I don't use it now, what's the point?" She smiled, just a flicker, and handed him a flash drive. "The video," she said. "Use it. Show them what's at stake. Here's the final powerful message that will stay with you forever." Back at his ranch the next day, Eastwood drafted letters to the Justice Department and state officials, demanding a federal review of police training and disciplinary processes. He called for public hearings, not in Washington, but in communities like Baton Rouge, where the people most affected could speak. The video, now verified and released with Sarah's permission, became a catalyst, not just for outrage, but for action. Lawmakers who'd stayed silent began to speak up, wary of the public's growing demand for change. Hollywood figures rallied behind Eastwood, organizing fundraisers for police accountability organizations, using their platforms to amplify the message. Eastwood didn't stop there. He reached out to advocacy groups, sat with families who'd lost loved ones to police misconduct, and lent his voice to legislation that would tie federal funding to police reform. It wasn't glamorous work. Bills moved slowly, compromises diluted ideals, but it was real, and he knew real change took time. The lesson of that night on the highway wasn't just about Kin's cuffs or Blake's suspension. It was about responsibility, the kind that starts with one person choosing to act, whether it's raising a phone or raising a voice. Eastwood learned it from Sarah, from the crowd at the community center, from the stories that poured in after the video went viral. Justice wasn't a moment. It was a movement built on the courage of ordinary people who refused to look away. If you're listening to this story, the message is clear, and it's one you need to remember. You don't need a title or fame to make a difference. Speak up. Show up. Hold the powerful accountable. The system isn't perfect, but it bends when enough hands push. Eastwood knew he couldn't fix it alone, but he could start where he stood, and so can you. Think about the people in your life who might face this. Think about the times you've looked away. This is your call to action. Don't wait for someone else. Be the person who records. Be the person who speaks. Be the person who stands. As Eastwood prepared for the next fight, a stack of letters on his desk, he felt a quiet hope, not in victory, but in the work itself, in the people who'd carry it forward long after the headlines faded. Because real change doesn't come from Hollywood. It doesn't come from fame or fortune. It comes from everyday people who decide that enough is enough, that justice matters more than comfort, that standing up is worth the risk. That's the lesson from that night on a lonely Louisiana highway. That's the legacy of one man who refused to back down and one woman who refused to look away. Now it's your turn. What will you do when you see injustice? Will you record it? Will you speak up? Will you stand? The answer to that question will define the world we live in. Choose wisely. Choose courage. Choose justice. And remember, the camera is mightier than the badge when wielded by the brave. Be brave. Be that person. The world is watching, and it needs you now more than ever.